If you've never been to a Bible college or a seminary, it is a little bit different, a good different. I can remember coming home from the first class at JBU, and I told my wife, I said, you wouldn't believe this place, because I had 100 hours at Northeastern State University before God called me to preach, and I just scrapped everything and then went to John Brown University. I came home and I said, they actually pray before they start the class. And it was a tremendous experience, and I had some of the best teachers over there. In fact, the reason I chose John Brown University is because most of the professors that I had, and either they're dead now, which tells my age, or they're retired, but they were all really respected in their field, and many of them were published. They had written commentaries in different books, and I have some of their books from Zondervan in my library, but they were fantastic instructors. But I will say this, some of the classes were very boring. And tonight might be a little bit boring because we're going to get into dates and names, but the reason we're doing that is because we're building a foundation for this book. I'll be honest with you, most people that I know of don't like reading the prophets, and the reason they don't like reading the prophets is because they don't understand them. There's a few verses in there that maybe they've heard pastors expound on, and as a result of that, they say, oh, I like that passage of Scripture in the book of Isaiah. But if the truth be known, they know nothing about the book itself. But the reason they don't is because they don't have the foundation. And tonight we're going to lay that foundation, not only for the book of Amos, but for all of the prophets. And I guess, again, if you're here tonight, I guess you know that we're starting a Wednesday night series on the book of Amos. Now, Amos is one of the 12 minor prophets. You see, most scholars divide the Old Testament prophets who penned books into two major categories. You have the major prophets and the minor prophets. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The minor prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Let's all say them together. Can't do that, right? Well, that's one of the first things you'll learn at Bible college. Of course, if you can't come in and memorize the books and you haven't memorized the prophets, then you're in trouble. But anyways, the only difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets is the length of their writings. In other words, the messages of the major prophets are not more important than the messages of the minor prophets. They're just longer in length. In fact, to give you an idea of the difference in size between the two, consider this. There are 183 chapters in the 5 books of the major prophets. And there are only 67 chapters in the 12 books of the minor prophets. The longest book of the major prophets, which is Isaiah, has 66 chapters. Just one less than all of the 12 minor prophets combined. And the shortest book in the minor prophets, which is Obadiah, has only 1 chapter. But my point is this, and this is a very important point. If I was actually a professor, I would be giving you tests, and this would be on the test. Don't think that the major prophets are more important than the minor prophets. They're not. They're just longer in length. Now, most Christians find the book of Amos difficult to understand because they're not familiar with the historical, cultural context of the book. So they don't know when and why he prophesied. They don't know who this prophecy was to or what was happening at the time that warranted God actually sending a prophet to them. And to make matters worse, the different messages within the book of Amos aren't placed within a narrative. In other words, his prophecies are not placed within a story. So if you don't know what was happening at the time, then you don't know the context in which the messages and the prophecies were given. And people, that's a big problem. You see, if you don't know the context in which a prophecy was given, then determining the meaning can be very difficult, if not impossible. That's why it's so important to understand the historical, cultural context of the book. Does that make sense? So this is my point. In order to understand a prophecy, you have to know the context in which it was given, the historical, cultural context. In fact, let me give an example to illustrate what I'm talking about, because if you don't get this point, you really won't understand hermeneutics, and that's a required class if you're going into theology. So you need to understand this. So let me give an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Elijah and Elisha are known as oral prophets as opposed to writing prophets. In other words, they prophesied, but they didn't write their prophecies down. So we don't have a book of Elijah or a book of Elijah in our Bible, do we? But we do have stories about them, and within these stories, they prophesied. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 4, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Get thee hence, and turn thee eastward, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. And it shall be that thou shalt drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you know the story behind this prophecy. You know that Ahab was a wicked king over Israel, and he was married to Jezebel. And we don't just refer to her as Jezebel. What do we refer to her as? That wicked Jezebel, right? Because she worshiped the pagan god Baal. And she not only supported 400 priests of Baal, but she also tried to kill all of the prophets of the true God of Israel. Now, Baal was the Canaanite god of fertility. He was responsible for bringing in the rain, or so they thought. So to prove that Baal was a false god, and Yahweh was the one true God, not just the God of Israel, but the God of this world, Elijah prophesied that it wouldn't rain for 3.5 years, and it didn't. And this forced a showdown between Elijah and the priest of Baal at Mount Carmel. How many of you remember the story? Now, my point is this. If you had a book of Elijah that consisted of all his prophecies, but it didn't place his prophecies within a narrative, in other words, within a story, you'd have a very difficult time trying to understand his prophecies because you wouldn't know the context in which his prophecies were given. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I'm going to go a little bit further with my illustration. Look back at 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 4, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. Now, people, technically, that is a prophecy. He predicted that it would not rain until he gave the okay, and it didn't. That's a prophecy. And then he continues on with the prophecy. Notice verse 2. And the word of the Lord came unto him. So God spoke to him, saying, Get thee hence and turn thee eastward. So this is a prophecy. And hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. And it shall be that thou shalt drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there. So he was told what to do, and then God told him, this is what will happen in the future. You're going to drink from this brook, even though every other brook's going to dry up, and I'm going to command the ravens to feed you there. And did that happen? It did happen. Now, if these 4 verses were all you had, and you didn't know the context in which this prophecy was given, in other words, you didn't know the story behind this prophecy, you would struggle trying to understand the meaning of the prophecy, because you wouldn't know who he was prophesying to, or why he prophesied that it wouldn't rain for 3.5 years, or what the circumstances were that he was supposed to go hide after he gave this prophecy. And without knowing all of that, you'd struggle trying to understand the meaning of this prophecy. So he prophesied that it wouldn't rain. So what? Why did he do that? So he was told to go hide after he prophesied. Why? Well, if you don't know the story, you don't know any of that. You have to understand the story to understand those prophecies. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, people, that's how it is when it comes to the minor and the major prophets. You have all of these prophecies and all of these messages written down, but they are not placed within a narrative. In other words, they're not placed within a story. So you don't know the context in which these prophecies and messages were given. And without knowing the context, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to understand them. That's why we study the historical, cultural context of each book. You see, by knowing the historical, cultural context of each book, it's easy to understand the prophecies and the messages, because we know who they were prophesying to, and why God sent them to prophesy to that particular person or nation. And we also know what was happening at the time and when it all took place. So we're able to place their prophecies and their messages into the proper context, which enables us to understand them. In other words, we are able to build the narrative from the historical, cultural context. That is so important, I'm going to repeat it again. And when I repeat something again, what should you do? Write that down. If you want to understand the Bible, I am giving you the key right here, especially when it comes to the prophetical books. We're able to build the narrative. In other words, we're able to build the story from the historical, cultural context. And if you know the story, you understand the prophecies. Just like when you were reading about Elijah telling Ahab it wasn't going to rain until he gave the okay. Now, we know from the book of James that it lasted for 3.5 years. The drought did. No rain, no dew for 3.5 years. You wake up in the morning and there's no dew there. How many of you, when you wake up and there's no dew on the ground, you say, yes, especially in the summertime? Why? Because you can mow at 6 o'clock in the morning, right? When it's cool. Well, for 3.5 years, there wasn't even dew on the ground. But we want to know, why did he prophesy that? Well, we're lucky. He gives us the story behind it. But when we get to the prophets, we don't have that story. But we can build the story or build the narrative from the historical, cultural context, which makes all the difference in the world, right? Yes, because now it's as if we have a story to place these prophecies into, making them easier to understand. So what I'm telling you is that Amos is really not that difficult to understand, as long as you know the historical, cultural context in which it was written. And you're in luck. I know that. And I'm going to be sharing that with you as we go through the book of Amos. But first, I want to give you some background information that you need to know whenever you're studying one of the major or minor prophets. In fact, this background information is part of the historical, cultural context of this book. Now, again, what I'm getting ready to share with you is boring. But it's very, very important. In fact, it's so important that I would encourage you to do one of two things. I would encourage you to listen to this again when we put it on the web. And if you have a program like Camtasia, when I show you some of these charts, you take Camtasia and you take a picture of what's on the screen, you print it off, and you put it in your Bible. Or you buy the DVD so that you can go back when you're studying the prophetical books and watch this. That's how important it is. So, let's start at the time of King Solomon's death. Solomon died somewhere around 930 BC. Now, that's an approximate date. I believe it was probably in 930. Some people place it at 931, others at 922. But when I look at all the other dates, I believe that he died in 930 BC. And at his death, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. But he also inherited a kingdom that was burdened by taxes, and he forced manual labor from all of the different tribes. In other words, if you were part of the tribes, at least 1 month out of the year, not only did you have to give quite a bit of your bounty to King Solomon, but you also had to go work on some type of public project 1 month out of the year. So he inherited this kingdom that was burdened with taxes and with forced manual labor. So shortly after he ascended to the throne, he was approached by the leaders from the northern tribes, and they demanded relief from the oppressive policies of his father. And of course, you know the story. Rehoboam refused their demands, and a civil war broke out, which eventually split the kingdom in two, north and south, much like our Civil War. How many of you remember studying the Civil War? We had a north and south, right? Well, the North won, the Union won, the Confederates lost, and as a result of that, we maintained a unified nation. Well, when these 10 tribes broke away, there was a civil war. The problem is, it didn't remain unified because the southern tribes, Judah, Rehoboam, and his followers, they lost the civil war. So the kingdom was split into two. You had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was made up of 10 northern tribes, and they kept the name Israel, while the southern kingdom became known as Judah. So whenever you're reading through the Old Testament and it mentions the nation of Israel after the split in 930 BC, it's referring to the 10 northern tribes. It's not referring to the unified nation. Judah refers to the southern kingdom. It was made up of 2 tribes. What tribes was it made up of? Anyone know? Judah and who? Simeon. Simeon actually was a part of Judah if you go back and look at the way the land was divided. But anyways, you need to keep that in mind so you don't get confused as you're reading through the Bible, especially after the time period in which Solomon died and this kingdom was split. Now, as you look at the screen, you're going to see a list of all of the kings in each kingdom from the time it split. But I want you to notice that I put a line in each box separating the kings that are mentioned in the book of 1 Kings from the kings that are mentioned in the book of 2 Kings. Do you see that? Everyone see that? Notice it's darker blue in one and it's darker gray in the other. The one that's darker gray, those are the kings that are mentioned in the book of 1 Kings. The ones in the dark blue, those are the kings that are mentioned in the book of 1 Kings. One's the northern kingdom, one's the southern kingdom. Israel's the blue, Judah's the the gray. Everyone see that? Well, in this series, we're only interested in the kings that are mentioned in the book of 2 Kings, because that's when the major and minor prophets ministered. So I'm going to expand that portion of the slide so we can focus on those kings, and that's a little easier to see. Wouldn't you agree? Now, all of the kings in the northern kingdom were evil in the sight of God. And they led their nation into idolatry, and they never repented of that. In fact, they just kept allowing it to get worse and worse. They actually wanted that. They actually encouraged that, kind of like what America is doing today. But because they refused to repent and turn back to the one true God, to turn back to their heritage, they were conquered by the Assyrians, and they were carried into captivity in 722 BC. That is a date that every Christian should memorize. 722 BC. That's when the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians and carried into captivity. Now, the capital of Assyria at that time was Nineveh. You've heard of that city, right? Yeah. I placed it on the slide because 2 prophets prophesied against Nineveh. Who are the 2 prophets? Do you remember? Jonah was one. Nahum was the second. Jonah prophesied against them and they repented. Nahum prophesied the destruction and they refused to repent, so his prophecy of destruction came to pass when the Babylonians defeated them. Which brings us to the Babylonian Empire. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquered the southern kingdom and took them into captivity. And I want to mention 2 things that most people probably are not aware of. You might have been a Christian for all of your life, and you're probably not aware of this because there are many scholars that are not aware of these 2 things. First of all, the southern kingdom continued to exist for another 136 years after the northern kingdom fell. And the reason why is because it had a few good kings who loved God, kept His commandments, and encouraged all of its people to keep the commandments. Whereas the northern kingdom didn't have one good king. Not one. All of their kings were evil in the sight of God. But here's what you need to understand, and this is what's important. The few good kings that the southern kingdom had prolonged the survival of their nation. In other words, those good kings kept God's judgment from coming upon them, at least temporarily. How long? Well, at least for 136 years. What you're going to find out is that actually Judah was much weaker than Israel, and yet when the Assyrians came in and conquered the northern kingdom, they didn't conquer the southern kingdom. Why? God, and only God. But why did God prolong their survival? Why was His judgment postponed? Because they had some good kings. Now, eventually they fell too, because the majority of their kings were evil, but those few good kings prevented God's judgment from coming upon them, at least temporarily. They were able to postpone God's judgment for 136 years. Now, who were the good kings in the southern kingdom? Do you know? Well, there were 8 of them. In other words, there were 8 that did right, that kept God's commandments, that tried to rule and reign the way that God told those kings to rule and reign. Here are the 8. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joaz, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. Almost all of the ayahs, right? Yeah. The second thing I want to mention that most people don't know, and this is very important, is that when the Babylonian Empire began to grow, it conquered the Assyrian Empire. So all of the people from the northern kingdom of Israel who were carried into captivity by the Assyrians became a part of the Babylonian Empire. Do you see that on the screen? The Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, and they incorporated that kingdom into their own, which meant that all of the people from the northern tribes who'd been deported went into the Babylonian Empire. And we sometimes forget that, but it's very important because they were able to return to the land of Israel when Cyrus gave the decree. So to refer to the northern tribes as the 10 lost tribes is a misnomer. People, they're not lost and they never were. Let me explain something about the Assyrians. One of the things that the Assyrians tried to do when they conquered nations to keep them from rebelling against them is they would deport the people. And they would take up a whole city sometimes, or a whole village, and they would move them outside of their kingdom and place them inside another kingdom. But here's what's interesting about the Jews. God had so ingrained within them that they were separate. that they were not supposed to mingle with others. And their culture and their customs were so different than the pagans around them that they kept that culture even when they were outside of their own kingdom. So when they were allowed to go, or not allowed, they were deported and they went into other kingdoms, they still maintained their own villages. They still maintained their own community. Now, is that what the Assyrians wanted? No. What the Assyrians intended was to almost be like America. When people come to America, it becomes a melting pot. And so you might have your ancestors from Ireland, and some of you might be from Italy, and some of your ancestors might be from Russia. But, you know, if you're second or third generation, you're part of this melting pot. That didn't happen for the Jews. So even though they were in captivity for 136 years in a different country, they stayed within their own little villages. So when the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, they're still there, but they become part of the Babylonian Empire. And then when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and you understand that story, it becomes the Persian Empire, Cyrus gives the great decree, and he allows all of the people to go back to their homelands. Yeah. Most people don't. Why? Because they had assimilated with everyone else. It was a melting pot. And even though it had been almost 200 years, these Jews were not like that. And so you had a lot of the northern tribes, they actually went back to Israel and settled in the Galilean area. How many of you knew that? Not many scholars know that, people, but it's true. So to refer to them as the 10 lost tribes is a misnomer. Every time I hear that, the thing that I realize is they have a liberal education background. Yeah. Now, following the Babylonian captivity, we have the period known as the post-exile. It's that period of time in which those who were carried into captivity were allowed to return to Israel. And 3 books were written during that time period: Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So when you're reading those books, you need to realize, okay, Cyrus has given the great decree, people are allowed to move back, and now these books are written, and they're writing to the Jews who have returned during the exile. Now, Esther didn't return, but you're getting a picture into the Persian Empire and how God spared those who had been scattered. And that's why you had all of those Jews, even in Iraq, in modern times. Now, let me show you when each prophet ministered and to whom they ministered to, because this is very important. Why? Well, I'll explain why in just a minute. Let's begin with the major prophets. First, you have Isaiah. People, Isaiah had a very long ministry. He ministered anywhere between 62 to 64 years. I'm not talking about living. I'm talking about prophesying. He ministered for about 62 to 64 years. His ministry spanned 4 kings: Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. You'll find that in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. Secondly, you have Jeremiah. Now, the interesting thing about Jeremiah is we have a tough time determining where to put him, because he actually prophesied before the Babylonians came. But he also prophesied after they were carried into captivity for a brief period of time. In fact, the book of Lamentations was actually written as a result of the temple being destroyed and them being carried into captivity. So he ministered during both time periods. So his ministry went for quite a while. Next you have Ezekiel, and then you have Daniel. Now, I want you to notice that Isaiah and Jeremiah ministered before the Babylonian captivity, and Ezekiel and Daniel ministered during the Babylonian captivity. And as I already mentioned, Jeremiah is kind of in between there. Now, let's look at the minor prophets and when they ministered. You have Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Hosea ministered to the northern kingdom at the time of Jeroboam II. He was a very important king. What you're going to notice is a lot of prophets were sent to Israel during this time period. And if you're inquisitive, you should be asking, why? This guy ruled for 41 years, but I'm getting ahead of myself. He was a very important king in Israel. Joel was a very early prophet who ministered to the southern kingdom during the reign of Amaziah. Amos ministered to the northern kingdom at the time of Jeroboam II. So as you can see, he ministered about the same time as Hosea. In fact, he was probably just a year or 2 before him. The only difference between the two, besides their messages, was where they came from. Hosea was from the northern kingdom, so he was prophesying to his own nation. But Amos was not from the northern kingdom. He was from the southern kingdom. So he was an outsider. Now, why is that important? I'll tell you why it's important. Think about us today. It's one thing for you to be an American and to criticize America. But you let some foreigner come here and criticize America, what do? Well, we're offended. We need to ship them back. You don't like America, then you get out. Right? But if you're from America, you can criticize America. It's kind of like your family. You know, you might know your family is crazy, and you can talk about your family being crazy, but no one else better talk about your family being crazy. Am I right? All right. Hosea is from the northern kingdom. So when he prophesies to them, they're more receptive to that. Do they receive him? No. But at least they're more receptive. When Amos comes, let me tell you, the head priest, the high priest, actually writes to the king and says, we need to deport this guy. Who is he? In fact, maybe we ought to string him up because he's an outsider. Obadiah prophesied against Edom probably during the reign of Jehoiakim, but we're really not sure. Some place him during the reign of Jehoram. Now, why in the world would he, one chapter, actually prophesy against Edom? Because the Edomites were brothers to the Israelites. What do you mean by that? Well, they're the descendants of who? Esau. And just as there was animosity between Jacob and Esau, there's always been an intense hatred between the Edomites and the Israelites. Now let me ask you a question. Who are the Palestinians? The true Palestinians. The ones who didn't come in because there was work when the Jews started repopulating and they came because of the work. I mean the ones who had been living there for the last 2,000 years. Who are the Palestinians? Anyone know? Edomites. You want to know why they hate Israel? Because this hatred goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau. And it's part of the prophecies that if you understand the Bible, you understand the intense hatred. It doesn't matter if you gave them all of Israel and Israel would subjugate themselves to them and allow them to rule. Let me tell you, they would still want to kill all the Jews. You need to understand that. You cannot appease them. Obadiah prophesies against Edom. Anyways, getting off. Jonah prophesied to Nineveh. He prophesied during the later years of Amaziah, king of Judah, and during the early years of Jeroboam, the second king of Israel. So as you can see, he prophesied a little bit earlier than Amos and Hosea. But he still prophesied during that period of Jeroboam the second, his early years. Micah prophesied during the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. He was a contemporary of Isaiah, and he prophesied to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So he wasn't just exclusive to one kingdom. No, he prophesied to both of the kingdoms. Look at Micah chapter 1, verse 1. I think this is important. It says, the Lord gave this message to Micah of Moresheth during the years when Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah were kings of Judah. The visions he saw concerned both Samaria and Jerusalem. Samaria, as most of you know, was the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem was the capital of the southern kingdom. So basically what this is saying is he prophesied to the northern kingdom and also to the southern kingdom. Nahum, like Jonah, prophesied against the Assyrian Empire. Now, under Jonah, the Assyrians repented and judgment against them was postponed. Here's what's interesting. The good kings in the southern kingdom postponed God's judgment coming upon them because they repented of what their previous leaders had done and they turned to God. But here's what's interesting. That principle doesn't just apply to God's chosen people. It also applies to the Gentiles. Because when Jonah came in and he prophesied to Nineveh and he said destruction is coming, we know the story in Jonah, right? They repented. They fasted. And God spared them. And Jonah was upset. Why? Because they were an enemy of Israel. Why would God do that? Because God is just as concerned about Gentiles as he is the Jews. In fact, the Jews were supposed to be a witness to the Gentiles. Now, because they repented and this judgment was postponed, the Assyrian Empire continued on for another 70 years approximately. But they didn't repent when Nahum came to them and prophesied against them. And as a result, they were conquered by the Babylonians. And from that point on, they are never mentioned again in history. No. Completely and totally wiped out. The Assyrian Empire never rises again. They're not just conquered, they're completely wiped out. Why? Because Nahum prophesied that. It was a judgment upon them because of their cruelty. Habakkuk was a contemporary of Jeremiah. Now, everyone knows what I mean by contemporary, right? Contemporary simply means that they prophesied at the same time. Now, if you want to know what the conditions were like when Habakkuk prophesied, you should read 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 11 through 21, and Jeremiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 30. In essence, the spiritual condition of Judah was one of wickedness, injustice, and a total disregard of God and the things of God. So in chapter 1, verse 6, Habakkuk prophesies that God is going to send the Chaldeans against Judah. Now, who are the Chaldeans? Technically, I can't say that the Babylonians, but they are. Actually, they're the southern tribes of Babylon, but they become the ones in power. So Nebuchadnezzar is coming from that period. So those are the Babylonians. So he prophesies that the Babylonians are going to come and is going to conquer his own nation. But this causes the prophet to question the justness of God. Because basically Habakkuk wants to know how the Lord could punish Judah by using a nation that's more wicked than they are. In fact, if you read Habakkuk 1:13, that's Habakkuk questioning God. God gives him this prophecy and he says, boy, these people are going to be wiped out. And it's his own nation. And he said, God, I don't understand this. You're going to use a nation that's more wicked than us to come in and conquer us? I don't get that. People, you better listen. God can use Russia and China against us. These have specific messages that can be applied today. I'll give you God's answer when we go through his book. Nah, what the heck, I'll give it to you now. Basically, God tells Habakkuk, don't worry about them. They'll get what's coming to them. You just worry about yourself and your own nation. And you know, God gives us that lesson all the time. You ever notice when God starts teaching you something and you're going through a difficult time, you always look at your neighbor and you go, well, look at them, God. I know they do the same thing as me and they're doing good. And usually God comes and says, don't worry about them, just worry about yourself. You remember when Jesus was with his disciples and he was talking about what was going to happen to them, and they looked at this one and they said about the disciple whom Jesus loved, well, what about him, Lord? And Jesus says, don't worry about him, just worry about yourself. Yeah, that's what he tells Habakkuk. Habakkuk, don't worry about them. The Babylonians will get theirs, and they did. And we need to understand that. Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of Josiah between 630 and 625 BC. So he was also a contemporary of Jeremiah, since Jeremiah began his ministry sometime around the year 626 BC, and we know that because of Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 2. So Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and Zephaniah all prophesied around the same time. How many of you knew that? Oh, yeah. So it's wonderful to take those three prophets and study them together. Haggai prophesied during the post-exile period. In other words, after the 70 years of captivity under the Babylonian Empire. Haggai dated the beginning of his ministry in the second year of Darius the king. You find that in chapter 1, verse 1, which means he ministered around 520 BC. Now, Zechariah and Malachi also ministered during the post-exile period. Now, after the book of Malachi was finished, there were 400 years between when that book was finished and the New Testament period. And most scholars refer to this period of time as the 400 silent years. How many of you have ever heard of the silent years? Referring to this 400-year period between the last prophet, who was Malachi, and when John the Baptist came. That was a period of about 400 years. And so scholars refer to that period of time as the silent years. But people, that is a misnomer. How many of you know what the word misnomer means? The real meaning of misnomer. A misnomer is a wrong or inaccurate name. Now, the reason that's an inaccurate name is because the Bible is not silent about what happened during those 400 years. In fact, we know exactly what happened during those 400 years. Daniel predicted what would happen in chapter 11, verses 5 through 35. And here's what's really interesting. He prophesied in great detail about what would happen during those 400 years, and it happened exactly as he prophesied it would. In fact, let me tell you, this is why liberals reject the book of Daniel. Because when they study the book of Daniel, that passage of Scripture, and they see what happened during those 400 years, they say, no one could have ever predicted it that precisely. Someone else had to have written that after the facts had occurred, and then they attributed it to Daniel. And that's what liberals still say today. But people, there's no way that could have happened. I'll tell you why. The book of Daniel was translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ. Yeah. Not only that, If you ever go to Israel, you'll go to a place called Qumran. That's where they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found almost every book in the Bible except for the book of Esther. But anyways, they found almost every book of the Bible. In Isaiah, they found almost a complete copy. But they also found the book of Daniel. And they can date that back to around 250 BC. So we know for a fact that Daniel predicted it before it ever happened. Isn't that interesting? Now, let me give you the chronological order of the writings of the prophets. These are the prophets who prophesied before the exile, before 586 BC. I told you this would be boring with dates and names, but this is very important, and you're going to understand why in just a minute. Obadiah prophesied to Edom, the descendants of Esau, in 845 BC. Joe prophesied to Judah sometime between 825 and 811. Jonah prophesied to Assyria sometime between 790 and 780 BC. Amos prophesied to Israel sometime between 768 to 755 BC. This 13-year period, that's very important for us. Isaiah, and again, his ministry spanned, so we're not saying he prophesied sometime between. We're saying he prophesied from the beginning of this time all the way down to here. He prophesied to Judah from 760 all the way down to 698. His ministry lasted between 62 to 64 years. What a man of God. Hosea prophesied to Israel sometime between 750 to 725 BC. Micah prophesied to Judah sometime between 735 to 700 BC. Nahum to Israel between 630 and 612. Zephaniah to Judah sometime between 630 to 625. Jeremiah to Judah from 626 to 575 BC. Now notice, he prophesied before the Babylonian Empire conquered Israel, but he also prophesied after they were carried into captivity for a little while. Habakkuk to Judah sometime between 612 and 606. During the exile, you had 3 prophets who prophesied, and I mentioned Jeremiah again because he prophesied from 626 to 575. Ezekiel prophesied from 595 to 560 BC. He was carried away in the second deportation. Daniel prophesied, and he had a very long ministry. He was 14 years old, we think, when he was carried into captivity as part of the first deportation. When did the first deportation take place? 605 BC. Now, remember, we talk about 586 as being when they destroyed. The first time the Babylonians came and they surrendered Jerusalem, they just surrendered. They didn't want to fight. So they said, we'll pay tribute. As a result of that, they began paying tribute. Jeremiah was prophesying, said, give in to him. This is part of God's judgment. Just do it, and you'll be able to survive. We'll still have to be under it for 70 years. But they wouldn't do that. They rebelled, and so Babylonians came back, and they did a second deportation. That's when Ezekiel went in. And then the third time they came back, because Judah did not listen to the prophet Jeremiah, they totally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And they carried everyone back except the poorest of the poor. Just wiped out the land, all because they wouldn't listen to what Jeremiah prophesied. And there were 3 prophets who prophesied after the exile. Haggai in 520 BC, Zechariah sometime between 520 and 518, pretty specific. And Malachi prophesied sometime between 445 to 415 BC. Now, you can see the time periods in which these prophets prophesied. I got those lines up there. That confused you all with the lines, right? Well, I want you to see who they prophesied to. And let me blow that up. I want you to notice that Hosea and Amos prophesied to the northern kingdom, but you had 3 prophets who prophesied to Gentiles. Why? Because God was just as concerned about the Gentiles as he was Israel. So why does he spend so much time with Israel? Because they are the nation through which his revelation is supposed to come. The reason we know about God is because of Israel. They were chosen to be a light unto the world. And of course, they paid a great price for their disobedience. But God has not forgotten them, and the church has not replaced them. And if you've been brought up with replacement theology, that is wrong. All of the promises that God made to Israel will be kept. That's one of the main purposes of the millennium. All these promises that God made to Israel will be carried out. America better not turn their back on Israel. One of the reasons we've lasted as long as we've lasted and will continue, and God's judgment will be postponed even though we deserve God's judgment upon us for our immorality, is because we've got Israel's back. And if you don't believe that, let me say, you better get on your hands and knees and start praying to God and studying the Bible because you don't know squat. Then you had the 4 prophets who prophesied to the southern kingdom, the 3 during the post-exile. Now, the prophet we're going to be studying during the summer is the prophet Amos. I get long-winded, but we're going to try and cover a chapter a night. Don't know if that's possible, but we're going to try. So let me ask you a question. Why is all of this important? I spent all of this time going through all of the prophets and when they ministered and who they ministered to and who was the king at the time when they prophesied. But why is all that important? I told you this would be like a seminary class, and you're listening and you go, you're right, this is boring. Why is this important? It's important because now we can study the historical, cultural context of the book. You see, now we know the time period in which Amos ministered, 768 to 755. We've narrowed it down to a 13-year period of time. And we know which kingdom he ministered to, Israel, which is the northern kingdom. And we know who was the king at the time, Jeroboam II. So now I can study the history and the culture of that specific kingdom at that specific time. And that's going to give me the context that I need to understand his messages and his prophecies, because when he was giving his messages and his prophecies, he didn't give it within a narrative. So I've got to build the narrative. And how do you build the narrative? How do you understand the story in which these prophecies and these messages were given? Well, we do that by studying the historical cultural context. In other words, by studying the historical cultural context, I know exactly what was happening at the time. And then when I place the messages and prophecies of Amos within that context, I'm able to understand them. Believe it or not, they make perfect sense. Is everyone with me? That's why it was so important to show you all of these charts with all of the kings in both kingdoms and all of the prophets and where and when they prophesied. We had to do that so we could place the messages and the prophecies of Amos within the proper time period, so we could study the history and culture of Israel at that specific period of time. And that helps us to build the narrative in which to place the prophecies of Amos. So now we can understand them. Listen to me. Dating a book is very important. Most people just skim over that. I never skim over that. It's kind of like genealogies. If you've been with me a long time, I study every genealogy because there's always a golden nugget that's stuck in there, right? Well, let me explain something about dates. In fact, the best way for me to explain it is probably to give you an example to illustrate it. Let's suppose that we were not the generation that would see the Lord's return. I believe we are. I'm about 99.9% positive that if I live to be at least 85 years old, I will see the Lord's return. Why do I believe that? I believe that because of the prophecy that Ezekiel gave. If you were here when I taught on Islam in the end times, you know that Ezekiel gave one of the most specific prophecies ever. Even more specific than Daniel, when Daniel gave the exact day, the exact month, the exact year when the Messiah would come in and present himself as the triumphant Messiah. Ezekiel went even further. Ezekiel prophesied the exact year, the exact month, the exact day that Israel would become a nation, and they did. And when you study the book of Jeremiah and you go back to the valley of the dead bones, it says, this generation that sees this, they will know that his prophecies are true. And when you study that in context, what it's actually saying is, you're going to see these things come to pass. We are the generation that will see it. And I believe that America will not be a player. That's why it's really not prophesied about much in the Bible. We've sunk. We're doomed. But we don't have to be nihilistic about it. We have to know that if we begin to serve God, that God spares us. And I've never seen the righteous begging bread. That's what David said. And we won't be if we do what God tells us to do. But I want you to understand that we are that generation. Now, casting that aside, and let's suppose that wasn't true, and let's suppose that Christianity would go another 2,000 years, and let's suppose that the Bible wasn't finished. So let's suppose that God sent a prophet to America, and he prophesied to the nation of America. And 2,000 years later, someone has that prophecy, and he wants to understand what this prophecy means to the nation of America. So he starts trying to study when this prophecy was given. And he narrows it down to 1960 to 2016. So somewhere between 1960 and 2016, this prophet ministered to America and he gave these prophecies. Well, people, let me tell you, that's pretty broad. Because in the 60s, you had the hippie culture. You had the sexual revolution. You had rock and roll. You had Vietnam. You had, in a sense, kind of an acceptance of drugs among the younger people. And then in the 70s, we had Jimmy Carter. Oh, God. 18% interest rates. Gas lines. Iranian crisis. Our foreign policy went to pot. Thank God for Reagan. I'm a conservative. Reagan came in and saved it. And then we had the tech boom in the 90s. No one ever dreamed that every home would have a computer. Now you've got a computer in the form of an iPhone. I ask a question and you Google it on your phone. Let me tell you, the reason it was prosperous under Bill Clinton is not because Bill Clinton was some genius. He just happened to be the right president at the right time when technology boomed. And then you had the internet, Al Gore invented. And here's what's interesting. All these .com companies came in, and then it went boom because they weren't built on anything physical. And as a result, many of you lost money in the stock market. And then 9/11 hit. Oh my gosh, terrorist attack. Twin Towers fell. And the culture in America changed. And then things got better, and we kind of forgot about it. And we had the housing bubble. Boom, it exploded in the Great Recession, and here we are. Now, I want you to understand, even though this has only appeared from 1960 to 2016, 56 years, we go, wow, that's kind of hard to place this prophecy. The closer we can get to the precise time, if this prophecy was given to the 1960s, we can really understand, because we understand the hippie culture, what was taking place, and with Vietnam, and we understand the sexual revolution and the drugs that were being taken. So we go, I understand the narrative in which this prophecy was given. But if it wasn't in the 60s, it was in the 70s, we go, oh yeah, America was kind of in a decline in their foreign policy. They weren't the big bad people anymore. They didn't have a president that said, calling it the evil axis and calling these people up and saying, Gorbachev, that wall needs to come down. But if it was during that time period, we would know exactly, we could build the narrative for it. Or if it's when the Twin Towers fell, and that period of time when everyone was concerned about the terrorist attack and what had taken place, and all of a sudden our world changed. And if these prophecies came at that point, we now have the narrative of the story in which to place these prophecies. See, the reason you don't understand the prophets is because you don't understand the historical cultural context. These prophecies were not given interwoven with a story. Therefore, you don't know the context in which they were given. But we can build the context. We can build the narrative if we know exactly when they prophesied, who they prophesied to, and what was taking place at the time. And once we know that, boom. All of a sudden, those prophecies make perfect sense. Now, the good news is, I've done all the work for you. The bad news is, I still have 20 pages to go. But we're going to stop right here. The thing that I want you to understand is, I've showed you the foundation. So now when I come back next week, and I start explaining the specific situation of Israel in this 13-year period, you go, oh, now I understand what Amos was doing, why he prophesied what he prophesied. Because we built the narrative by narrowing down when he prophesied, who he prophesied to, and what was taking place at the time.
There's a chair that's never moved, a cup that still remembers you. Sunlight spills across the floor, just like it did before. I kept your books upon the shelf, didn't change a thing myself. Every creak inside this home whispers softly, you're not You speak, and shadows I reply, and light our echoes drift through velvet night. Between the pulses I hear, you're mine. In every pause, your soul I find. No words remain, no need to prove. The silence hums the sound of silent frequencies between our hearts, telling stories when the talking parts. I feel you move beneath my skin like a signal I can't pin. Silent waves, they call me home where no one speaks, yet I'm not alone. Reflections bend the tone. You fade in static.